Hello everybody, and welcome to episode 70 of Competitive Magic with the Carnies. I'm your host from Italy, Andrea Mengucci, and joining me today we have a special guest. It's Max Kominowski, also known as TwinlessTwin. Thank you, Max, for joining us today.
Yeah, how's it going, everyone? I'm here to talk about Murktide. I actually was just looking back. Last time I was on the Carnies, it was just about a year ago. And this time I have even better news. I qualified for the Pro Tour playing Murktide, so super excited about that. It'll be my first Pro Tour and excited to talk about it with you, Mengu.
Definitely, I was super happy this weekend to see the results of the American Regional Championship. Actually, you were even in contention for the top 8. You lost the very last round. It was very cool watching you and watching, of course, all the Murktide players do well. But yeah, you're definitely one of the Murktide content creator along myself that has believed in the deck always. So it's nice that you stuck to this deck, didn't change, and got the job done. So yeah, very very happy. And yeah, today we want to do this little dive in, right? Last week we did it with Marco Del Pivo on Team Rhinos, which ended up winning the American Regional Championship, and this week we want to do it with you, with Blue Red Murktide, which had a good win rate. I mean, people always look at that as in the overall sense of the tournament, but there is one type of data that I've loved to look. I've loved to look at the last American, at the last regional championship in Europe that was made by Sierkovitz, who did it again, which was these very cool,
Yeah.
players expected a 10 wins or more, and players with 10 wins or more. And Murktide placed very well there, since Murktide was only the 6th most popular deck, yet put 8 people with 10 wins or more. In particular, it was you. It was another player who came up above you. I believe his name is Tyler, if I'm not mistaken. Where is it? But yeah, so
right there.
Tyler, yeah, Tyler, Aaron Barrett. So maybe we can take a look at their list as well as yours. But obviously, while preparing for my RC, I watched a lot of your content because you do videos on Merc guides. And by the way, people maybe don't know it, but you have a YouTube channel and you upload there a lot. Like, I watched your matches against House of Man MTG on Amulet, which was very interesting. Your match against Eli Loveman on Yawgmoth. And I'm sure you made plenty more actual proper testing, not just leagues like I do. I think what you do is more is better from a study point of view. Mine is more might be content creation type of things.
Yeah, and I think that a big part of that, actually, the inspiration came from listening to the Carnies. I was preparing for the RC, and I think that everyone kind of knows Rhinos and Scam are very popular, as well as, Yawgmoth was picking up steam. Murktide had also had some really good results online recently, but it wasn't kind of until I listened to the Carnies episode where you were preparing your deck list, where you guys mentioned that this is the most condensed Modern has been in terms of a tier 1, really dominating and posting really high win rates and taking up a ton of slots in the top finish of all events. So when I saw that, or when I heard that, it definitely inspired me to focus more on those matchups. I think just hearing it brought it more into focus. I think in Modern often you're trying to plan for everything. You just have a broad sideboard plan and play broader cards, but I think a lot of the success can be, tightening that sideboard, making switches, like playing Flusterstorm over Spell Pierce, but just because Flusterstorm is better against the Cascade decks, even though Spell Pierce is a more broad card that you can use in more matchups. Making changes like that, I think, really led to success and making sure you have clean plans and have tested those top 5 matchups and really have a good feel for what matters there. So, I think that's kind of what inspired doing that really focused testing with masters of the respective archetypes, which was super helpful in having me prepared for the RC.
Yeah, for sure. The like, testing against the most important decks, it is actually how you practice. You don't just play like, let's say, 5 leagues on Magical Line and you're stuck against like Lantern Control for an hour. That's just a waste of your time. You just, again, doing that for content mostly. But so yeah, this is definitely how you should prepare for your tournaments. If your goal again is to win, is to actually knowing exactly what you do in the top matches. This means like, planning your sideboard ahead, like exactly knowing what is your plan, play draw. As you said here, very nice. No ley line of the void, like knowing exactly what you're going to do if you see it's open deck list. So if you see a scam list with no ley line, how do you sideboard? If you see a scam list with ley line, how do you sideboard? Like, just try to cover all the angles before the tournament so that when you arrive at the tournament, you have like very little time to figure things out, to know how to sideboard. You don't make mistakes, you don't draw.
Yeah, and I also I think that's
Sorry, Merc.
Yeah, exactly. I think that one thing I also found about leagues is not just that you're going to play against random decks, which is less helpful in this meta, but also not knowing what you're playing against created a pretty an experience that can't really be equated to the RC. Knowing what you're playing against game one with Murktide felt really, really valuable to me. I think some decks benefit in sideboarding, knowing what hate their opponents might have, like do you have Chalice of the Void or not. But for Murktide, the game one, it really matters because against a deck like Rhinos, you don't really want Lightning Bolt, but you really want, your Spell Pierce and Counterspell and Ragavan or Ledger Shredder. And so just having that information beforehand, I mulligan to 6 a lot more than I normally do because I normally find without open deck lists, I'm just keeping a lot of hands that, have a couple lands and some spells that you can cast like Bolt and Heat. And then you just have non-games where you're up against Living End or Rhinos and the Lightning Bolt does nothing and you don't have early threats. But like a 6 is perfectly serviceable in those matchups. So I think that getting that open deck list playtesting experience helped me practice that more and like removed a lot of wasted games where you're just gonna lose game one because of the open deck list, which is a cost of playing Murktide, I guess.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the limit of mine that I try to fix, but it's just so hard. Is that I learned to play Magic with the old Mulligan rules. Whereas maybe you and like newer players are much more used to Mulligan than me or some of the other old school guys, and this is definitely something that sometimes I keep hands that are like, I mean, if my opponent is playing Living End, they just can't win. But in open deck list, of course, you Mulligan a hand with 2 Unholy Heat against a Living End, but
right.
There is a lot of that, and I think that the open deck list deck discussion, if your deck is better or not, sure, you can talk about that a little bit, but after all, like, it's not that important, like you're not playing Murktide because it's open deck list. You're playing Murktide because
definitely,
it's inside out and everything, and then it's open deck list. Sure, Murktide probably benefits more, but
yeah, I think game one, it gave me more confidence to mulligan. I think that other decks also can see benefits, but a deck like Rhinos, game one playing against Murktide especially, there's not really a ton of hands that you mulligan specifically against Murktide, but not against other decks. So I think that it's less likely the opponent benefits playing against Murktide specifically. But that's not to say that all decks benefit from open deck list in one way or another.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to the list that you arrived to. So I would say that if you're listening to this podcast, you probably already know is it Murktide the list overall. So we're gonna just talk about the little differences. We're not gonna talk about for Ragavan or for Chandler type of things. Let's start with the creatures, okay? Actually, no. 1 second. Let's start with the new card because there's a new card, which
Sure.
the set didn't add too many new cards to the format. This card wasn't legal when I played the RC. So, Thundering Falls. So you decide to play one Survey land.
Yeah.
Of course, Thundering Falls is an island mountain, so you can be fetched by your 8 fetch lands. I remember playing 7, so you added a fetch land there. Because mostly you added a land. You cut an island for a Thundering Falls, and you added a fetch land. So yeah, so let me know a little bit.
Yeah. So
How was your experience with this land?
my experience was definitely very solid with it. I felt it was almost always worth it. I think that I actually took some notes on my matches just because I make content on Murktide, so I was planning on doing a write up regardless of how the event went. Unfortunately, I left them in the feature match area after I lost the win-in for top 8. So unfortunately, I don't have those notes. But I was noting stuff like, did Thundering Falls come up? And I fetched Thundering Falls. My estimate would be at least 75% of games, and it never really punished me. So I think that it's definitely worth it. I just think that having a card that impacts other cards in your deck is something that historically has been powerful. I mean, we've seen Mystic Sanctuary, which is definitely much more powerful than Thundering Falls is. But the fact that you can have, 8 other fetch lands that can some point get Thundering Falls, the Surveil is very relevant. I mean, every time you bin a card, you can essentially equate that to having drawn a card, essentially. So, that it's a very relevant effect, and I almost always had time to fetch it. In Murktide, you do a lot of passing with mana open because you play counter spells and instant speed interaction. So a lot of times, if your opponent doesn't make the play that you think they might, and you decide not to use your interaction, you can fetch the Thundering Falls. You also can often curve out, so you go 1-drop, 2-drop, 2-drop with like a counter spell or removal or something and still fetch the Thundering Falls. So I just never really found it to be very tricky. The key for me, though, is I cut a spell for the Thundering Falls. I think that Murktide really wants untapped lands, and I don't think that you want to play 18 lands with Thundering Falls. So that's why you saw I added a land. I decided to add a fetch land because I guess it gives more access to Thundering Falls and also my 2 islands. So that was kind of just where I netted out. I think Thundering Falls is great. I probably would stick with 1, but Rhino's players had 2, maybe even 3 copies, and it definitely does a lot of work.
Yeah, the surveillance have been amazing for me, honestly. I've tried them in a lot of decks, and honestly, I've been impressed by them in every deck. The only deck where it punished me once was Burn, and that was like the only
Sure.
deck that I think maybe can say like I don't want it. Everything else, I guess I haven't tried it in Yawgmoth, but outside of that, like Scam, Murktide, Zoo. I've seen the Esper Animator by Yuki went with 3 surveillance, and it's just the card is just fantastic, and I feel like it's definitely like if you plan on. If you have a modern collection, you definitely should acquire them all because they are going to be played in, just like all the decks, even like Leyline Binding decks. Like I played
Yeah.
the Adorus deck that came second at the RC, and you go like turn 1 black white surveillance, turn 2 catch a triumph, but Leyline Binding, and you got to surveil instead of getting double triumph. Like it's just a lot of things like this will just be like I think very nice for modern. And yeah, these lands are very good. Probably the best addition from the new set.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's just so free to have in your deck and affect all the fetch lands. So that the limit for how good the card has to be is pretty low. And just don't be cutting untapped lands is my recommendation for Murktide. You still want to make sure that you're hitting untapped land drops early on.
Yeah, so when I played a Murktide last week for my league, I cut a Steam Vent, so I was playing 2 Steam Vents. I was playing 18 lands, but again, this is fine. Like, it's not that I missed the 3rd Steam Vents, but I can see missing like an actual land and just drawing this instead of a land might hurt you at the beginning.
Yeah, I
So
think
that's a good
that's
point.
my fear mostly. I will note the Steam Vents versus Island piece. I still have 3 Steam Vents and only 2 Island. I only have 1 Blood Moon, so I didn't think that the islands were as important to have. And I have had it come up where if you have a DRC in play, you surveil over a Steam Vents, and then it's like if you only actually have 2 Steam Vents in your deck, then sometimes you can run out of red sources to fetch untapped. It randomly came up for me once or twice in the matches I was testing. And so I just decided to play the extra Steam Vents and cut an island. And I like having untapped red sources because any hand where it's like you can't cast your turn 1 creature because you have island, it just feels so bad in my opinion. So I'd rather hedge in that direction.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some more of the slots that you decided to play. So you had 1 Brazen Borrower. This was a card that I also had it in my sideboard when I played Murktide and my RC. It was mostly because it's very good against the two cards in particular. One is Murktide Regent in the mirror match, just bouncing it, it's just huge. And actually, like, you registering 1 main deck will make your opponent play so much differently. Like, usually you play Murktide at least 7/7 in the mirror match to dodge prayer day, to dodge a Nully Heat. But, if you like eat your old graveyard and then they bounce it, it's just the disaster. So you have to play maybe like smaller. Like, there's a lot of like small plays because maybe you could have played a Nully Heat earlier. There's just like, the mirror match is very much like foreseeing what their next play is, and
Yeah.
adding to that a Brazen Borrower is like a big deal. So that is one thing. And one more thing was for Leyline of the Void. That was my reasoning. What about you? What was your reasoning for putting in the main deck?
Yeah, so for me, I ended up putting it in the main deck because I had it in the sideboard, but when I was trying to make my sideboard mapping plans, I just was always kind of like, all right, this card feels fine. Like I think it's a nice flexible card, but it doesn't really shine against anything besides Murktide Regent mostly. But I did feel like it was always a card I'd be pretty happy with having game 1. Just because, I mean, it doesn't hit Leyline of the Void, so it is, better against Scam post board. I think that's a really good point of how Borrower can hit Leyline of the Void. But I did feel a big way to lose to Rhinos is generally with Murktide Regent. And so I liked having the Borrower there because it unsummons the Murktide Regent. And I just felt like it kind of solved my problem of sideboarding and not really knowing when it's good enough or not good enough. It's just a flexible threat, and I replaced a Shredder because I moved a Shredder to the sideboard, actually.
Yeah, you moved Shredder to the sideboard.
And that was kind of inspired by Pygonti, who I run the Patreon with. And the reasoning that he gave that made a lot of sense to me and kind of resonated was Shredder is very nice, especially on the play, but does feel a bit weaker on the draw. It sometimes is hard to resolve as a 2-mana creature. You want to start holding up interaction or interacting. And so the Borrower is like another threat. It's a piece of interaction. I think that it kind of is a pretty unique effect. There's also the Otawara, but having that extra bounce effect is going to give you more play against, different things, mainly Murktide, but that you never really know what you're going to bounce. You can bounce Agatha's Soul Cauldron to reset it if it has a Grist or Yawgmoth under it. You can bounce Grief Scam if you need to in a pinch game 1. Like sometimes just taking the pressure off is worth it. So there's a lot of stuff that can come up, and I just liked having it. Like I was like, this card always seems pretty good. I feel like it should deserve a main deck slot. So I think that the Murktide and Leyline of the Void are 2 really big points. And then also there was the murmurs of Leyline Rhinos with the new Leyline.
Right.
And funny enough, Brazen Borrower is a card that works pretty well against that because you can bounce the Leyline of the guild pack, which then means their Scion of Draco isn't this invincible 4/4 dragon with a bunch of abilities. I'm not sure I can name them all, but so that made me feel even better about having the borrower.
Yeah, one I guess we haven't mentioned it yet, but this is I guess the elephant in the room, something that we have to mention
Hmm.
eventually. It's this new card, Lilian of the Guild Pact, which I played a league with Murktide last Friday, and I got paired against this deck, and twice they went Lilian of the Guild Pact, Sign of Draco, turn two, game over. Like I had just no ways. At post Sideboard I had like cast into fire, explosives, I had it all, but they had this like 4/4 X proof thing with lifelink and vigilance, and there's just no way for me to beat it. So I've seen people actually splashing. I think Piegonte even splashing the pick your poison in the sideboard. That's the edict for enchantment, artifact, or flyers, and that could be something. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this was a card that we talked about in our Discord quite a bit, and I know there was one player who ended up bringing it to the event in their sideboard without playing any other green cards. They were just playing Pick Your Poison in the sideboard and a Breeding Pool, and I think that it makes a lot of sense. I was almost close to registering it myself. However, I think that if the Leyline Rhinos deck was around for a couple more days, I would have. But my time to react, it was just about a day before the RC and Decklist submission when this deck kind of broke out in my mind. And so I didn't have enough time to react. But Pick Your Poison is really flexible. You can board it against Yawgmoth to hit Soul Cauldron. You can board it against Urza's Saga decks. You can board it against, Amulet, which is an Urza Saga deck, but also it hits Amulet, a Vigor Defense Grid. You can hit the One Ring. It's not ideal because it's a sorcery, so they'll get to draw a card. But it has that flexibility. And then boarding it in the mirror, it hits Murktide. So I think that there it's probably strong and could potentially change the mirror a little bit, just because in the mirror I usually like taking out my Dragon Rage channelers, but maybe having more flyers to protect your Murktide Regent could come up if people play Pick Your Poison. Well, that's getting too far into the weeds, maybe. But yeah, I think Pick Your Poison makes a lot of sense and would be a good answer to the new Leyline Scion deck.
Yeah, I think the Lance Scion deck will be a real deal. Like even in Zoo, even in it's just Zoo's already a kind of a tough matchup. I've seen that you beat one in round number
Mm-hmm.
9.
Yep.
But yeah, it's definitely a tough matchup. Overall, I really like this list. I like that you also went for 4 lightning
Yeah.
bolts. Was there any reason for this?
Yeah, it was the player. I'm blanking on the name. Nil is their name. Nils, the player who top aided the European RC.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
Niels.
so they had 4 lightning bolts, 4 shredder, and I tried their Underworld Breach deck. To me, it didn't make a ton of sense because I like Murktide, obviously, so I'm biased, but I also always felt Underworld Breach where it shined most. I couldn't deny that it was better against decks with Solitude and Leyline Binding, just because it's
Yeah,
an
exactly.
Enteferi, so many ways to answer Murktide. And the Underworld Breach lets you draw 5 cards or just bolt them out of the game. And so I didn't really, I talked a little bit with a couple of the Breach players, and they said, I like Underworld Breach because then you can ignore Grist, which I understand. I didn't fully buy it, though, in the meta in a whole sense, because I think Murktide Regent's really important against Rhinos, and it's pretty important against Amulet and even Scam. And so, because of that, I did not play a Breach. However, when I saw their list, I thought 4 Bolt seems really good right now. Aside from it being like open deck list, so you kind of know if Bolt is good or not, a lot of the games that you lose from my experience playing Murktide is when you get behind a little bit. So say they play a Delighted Halfling, or they play, Scam has an aggressive start with a Grief Scam on the play. These types of draws, what you're really looking for is removal. And so I think that having that extra removal spell in your deck is going to make it so that you're not going to fall behind on the draw a lot. And then Bolt going face is still always relevant. Like we're playing the 2 shredder. I had 3 shredder for a while. And then the borrower even, is still a threat that can start attacking. And so I didn't find Bolt to actually be that bad, even in the matchups where it doesn't kill very many creatures. Just being able to send it face is fine. Like, we like to play pretty aggressively right now against a lot of decks. We could, a lot of the matches end up being tempo based. I think like against the One Ring deck, I would play a more grindy game, but against Amulet and against Rhinos, I like to be more aggressive usually. So I think that I found Bolt going face a lot more often. So, couple those together. And I think that the 4 Bolt makes a lot of sense.
We haven't mentioned the Breach type of deck, and I agree with your take that I just think that version was good when Up the Beanstalk was popular, or even when the One Ring was popular at the beginning, because the Soichid and the Inviting deck were a big deal in Teferi, but now I also prefer the Murktide Regent strategy. So on my RC, I played a lot of Subtlety and Force of Negation. You don't have any of those. I guess I was really very afraid of Amulet Titan, which, to be honest, it didn't end up doing too well in America. Like it was the 4th most popular deck. There was not that many, and I mean, it did overperform as Yawgmoth and Amulet always do, but it overperformed less than I guess less than you would expect to. There was not that many Amulet at the top tables, and so I guess, have you played against any? Let me check.
I did not play against Amulet.
Yes. Oh, you did not play against any. Yes.
Yes. So
yes, because this list is a little bit. I would say your main deck is definitely not the best main deck you can have against Amulet, with the 0 subtlety, and the Shredders and Borrower. Just like overall, I mean. Also, one thing I loved about your list is that you didn't have Magus of the Moon. Like, I actually wanted to cut it as well, because I felt that the ways you win against Amulet was with the Subtlety, the Force of Negation, and things like that. The Magus was actually there only for this matchup, and I was very close to cut it, but then I didn't. But I like that you did.
Yeah. So going over the Amulet matchup, I think that my testing matchups that are on the YouTube channel against House of Mana were super helpful. I also played some more matchups against my friend Karate Dom and against Dom Harvey as well. So some really veteran Amulet players. And what I found the same thing that you did, which was that Subtlety and Force of Negation seemed to be the cards that really won us the matchup. And I guess looking at it another way, the cards that would cause us to lose the matchup tended to be Defense Grid and the One Ring. So Subtlety is somewhat effective against Defense Grid just because it's free, so you can pay 3 mana, so it's actually castable through Defense Grid. But the One Ring is a card that is castable through Blood Moon. So when I had that heavy Blood Moon plan of 3 Blood Moons, which is where I started, I had Magus, I think 2 Magus and a Blood Moon. And I would just often lose anyways, because they'd play a One Ring and I wouldn't really have any pressure. And they'd just draw 6 cards and then kill my Magus and play a Primeval Titan. Because they got to put bounce lands into play for free, and they just had a ton of mana. So I found the same thing you did, where Blood Moon wasn't really as effective, but I think that counter spells plus pressure is still pretty effective. Overall, the matchup I don't think is as favorable as people historically have felt it to be. So I am not sure why Amulet didn't do well. I don't think Murktide is the reason it didn't do well. I think maybe the Rhinos matchup might be tricky, but
yeah, I think the Amulet is just a fantastic deck that has just a slightly bad matchup against the Rhinos, which was very popular. So I think that if you play against 5 or 6 Rhinos, you're gonna end up having a bad weekend overall. 14 rounds and things like that. But I like the Pithing Needle. I think it's super important against Grist, because that's your main ways to lose. Sure, they have Cauldron, but they have to go through hoops of playing a second Grist to Legend rule it out. It's not as easy for them to have a Grist on the table once you Pithing Needle. So I like to see that. I like to see no Cursed Totem. I think you had it at some point. and you cut it. Because again, as I said at the beginning, I watched your videos of testing, and it's again, if you want to become a better Magic player, there's a lot of content out there. Again, me and Max are definitely two creators who put out a lot of content, but I'm sure that Canister and Nassif and a lot of other creators put out there. So studying how they sideboard, studying how they like evolve, how they talk about the games and etc. will definitely help you out. And sometimes as you said, like you played away, you play with 2 Magus and 1 Blood Moon, even maybe in the video, and then you realize that they're not very important, and you end up cutting them. Like obviously they are important, but Murktide only has 15 slots, just like everybody
Right.
else. So you have to
Yeah.
like decide to go with, for example, you have 2 Cast Into the Fire, and this is like usually I've seen one, but you have 2 Cast Into Fire and 1 Brothers Zudin. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about the 2 Cast Into the Fire as well?
Yeah, so this was part of my realization against Amulet of losing to the One Ring, being Ancestral Recall or better. Cast Into the Fire is a great answer there. Amulet also has Defense Grid. Cast Into the Fire is a great answer there. So a big part was the Amulet matchup. If I'm cutting Blood Moon, I want to have, still make sure I have some sideboard plans that make sense. And I found Cast Into the Fire to be very strong. And then the other part is Yawgmoth. Soul Cauldron is a big pain for us, and if it ever resolves, I just wanted to have more outs post board to be able to answer it. So I had the 2 Cast Into the Fire, and I actually almost even went up to 3 at one point, but I think that I kind of found at the end I was getting a little bit too worried about the Yawgmoth and Amulet matchup, and I needed the extra slots for other matchups as well. But I think that Cast Into the Fire is great against Yawgmoth also because it can clean up Bowmaster, which can come up. Yawgmoth like really uses the material very well off Bowmaster. So I feel like hitting a Bowmaster and the token is also a pretty good use of your play. It makes their Court of Calling worse. It makes their Yawgmoth worse. It can make Grist worse, So those were the 2 matchups that Cast Into the Fire was mainly there for. But then there's also just random matchups, like you might face Hardened Scales, which was somewhat popular at the RC, and so it's not a bad card to have there. You might face Hammer, which I faced Hammer in this event. And so there's random places where the Cast Into the Fire can come up, and having 2 of them, I felt pretty good about, mostly for Amulet and Yawgmoth.
Do you sideboard Cast Into the Fire in against the Chalice of the Void decks like Blue-White Control or 4-color Omnath?
Against 4-color Omnath and Blue-White Control, I definitely would, because usually they have the One Ring. So it's a great way to answer that One Ring.
On top of One Ring.
And what I actually have found is that the protection trigger is annoying. It's unfortunate. But if you can stop them from drawing any cards, which Cast Into the Fire does, because if you respond to the first activation of the One Ring by exiling it, then it uses the last known information, which is 0 counter, so they draw 0 cards. So knowing that, if you can answer the One Ring before they draw any cards, the matchup gets a lot better, because usually how you end up losing is like they would be flooding and you actually can outgrind them pretty well, except for the One Ring then draws them 6 cards and now you're behind. So that's what I felt happened most often when I lost those matchups. And then hitting Chalice is just, gravy. It's important to have answers to Chalice, so it's nice that you can have a flexible card there. I wasn't expecting a ton of that, but of course there are players who are pretty dedicated to those decks, and I think it also had a reasonable performance. And I faced it. I did unfortunately lose to a 4-color Omnath deck, but if you look at that deck list, they actually had 2 Territorial Kavu, and that's what beat me, because they just had Territorial Kavu on the play games 1 and 3, and I couldn't get Delirium because they kept exiling my graveyard and just attacking me for 5. So it was pretty funny. This is a very unorthodox list, and the Kavu's got me.
One thing I like, the more you talked about the Cast Into Fire, the more I was thinking about Tishana's Tidebinder, that could be like playing in a similar role, like good against the One Ring, just a flash threat. Definitely a card that we tested at some point. Remember when it came out, I thought it would be great in Murktide. At the end of the day, I felt like it was just worse than a counter spell, and so I ended up cutting it. But maybe if you found this law for a second cast into fire, maybe you can have one Tisha's Tidebinder instead of the second cast into fire. Just thinking.
Yeah, no, that's
could be something to try.
That's a fair point, and I think that the reason I didn't try that, honestly, is because of what you said. I tried Tisha's Tidebinder. I was really excited for it, and it let me down. I felt like it was worse than a counterspell most of the time. The body wasn't very relevant, and it was 3 mana, so I just kind of was off that card entirely and didn't really consider it for this event because there was no data that showed me otherwise. I'm not even convinced that it's that great in Rhinos either, but I don't play Rhinos, so I'm not really qualified to speak on that. But yeah, so I just didn't like Tidebinder, but that is a card that does a similar effect to cast into the fire, so definitely worth considering.
Okay, so how about we get, we discussed the deck list. How about we get into some of the sideboarding plan against the most popular deck? That's always
sure.
a content that people love to take a look at. And of course, then Max has a Patreon, a Merc Guides. What's the Patreon exactly?
Yeah, it's Merc Guides.
The patreon.com/Merc Guides.
I think so. Well, now I should double check. It actually might be patreon.com/mercguide.
Because okay.
Mercguide. Yeah, it's
Mercguide, no S.
Yeah.
Okay, where you not only offer Cyber Guide, but definitely a lot more than that. So definitely check it out. So again, this was your list here. It's mapped on Magic Online. On my screen. If you're watching on YouTube, we're gonna do a little bit of it's much easier to map Cyber Guides on Magic Online because you can just drag cards around and everything. So let's start with the most popular deck, the Rhinos, where of course you have 5 easy cuts, Lightning Bolts and Stern Scolding, and where you have I would say 5 easy in.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you if you brought in the Force of Negation or not.
Yeah, so I'm writing a tournament report right now, which will be definitely up on the Patreon. I might just make it public for everyone because I think that there's it's fun content. But when I was making the sideboard plans, I originally thought Force Negation makes sense. It's good. There's a lot of spots where just countering the Rhinos, it's worth the pitch cast. And then the hard cast can be fine, in longer games, which does happen against Rhinos sometimes. But going back to, the card that I'm actually most scared of, it's usually Murktide Regent, and then postboard it's Endurance. So the card that I actually found myself more interested in is a copy of Subtlety. Yeah, you see where I'm going here. So I don't think you need 2 Subtlety because I think that it can be hard to hard cast. And so it's like, it's kind of a weird card where sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not, but I liked having 1 copy of Subtlety to complement my Brazen Borrower and my Otawara to have more answers to Murktide Regent. And then also I think that sometimes just Subtletying and Endurance can be relevant. The reason I don't think you need Force of Negation is because we're bringing in the 2 Engineered Explosives and Flusterstorms plus the Shredder. This gives you a lot more resilience to their Cascade plan than you have in game 1. So, Force of Negation is a card that's probably good in game 1 against Rhinos, just to have more answers to their Rhinos. But in post-board games, when you have the Flusters and the Explosives, I find myself a lot more worried about Endurance and Murktide. So if I were to board in a free pitch spell, it would probably be a pitch spell that helps deal with those cards. What do you think?
So what was the? So my cyber plan are on Channel Fireball, and I just want to double check, but I think I had 1 main deck Subtlety and I cut it. My reasoning for that is because yes, what you said is true. You're scared of Murktide Regent and Endurance a lot, but you also have 3 copies of Ledger Shredder, and the games usually get like long enough that when they play Endurance, you have a decent graveyard for Anoli Heat on Endurance. So I don't know. I feel like the subtlety is not needed. I'm wondering what you cut in place of the because like if you want to bring in a subtlety, then you need a 6th card to
Yeah.
bring in. Do you cut a Channeler?
No, actually, I cut an Unholy Heat. So, and that's, yeah, and I think that Unholy Heat is fine. I think it's mostly there to answer Endurance. It doesn't really answer Murktide very well a lot of the time. And so, and it's fine to like tag a Rhinos occasionally, but I think post board the Rhinos are going to be answered by either Flusterstorm or Explosives more often. So I think that Unholy Heat is a card where I'm usually happy to see 1 copy. You see a lot of cards in Murktide, so I felt fine with 3 copies of the deck. I wouldn't cut Channeler or Ragavan. Endurance is still very scary, so I think that's why you would be interested in cutting Channeler. But Channeler, like especially on the play, you have a lot of starts where you can get pretty aggressive early on, and then they need to have the Endurance or a Murktide, and the Rhinos become somewhat irrelevant because you can just kind of race them. And I've had a lot of that happen. It happened in my finals match on game 1. That's before they have Endurance, but I had like a Ragavan and a Channeler, and I just killed them super fast with it. And then the Surveils are also super relevant from Channeler, so despite its weakness to Endurance, I'm still pretty happy to have it in.
Yeah, this past week I've recorded a match against Marco Del Pivo. We went to the Mangus workshop. This new YouTube channel of mine. We have the office. We played some nice gameplay. Me and Pivo. It was the first time for us both to try the surveillance, and it was a very interesting match. It will go on this week, as if my editor can finish it this week. Is great, and I think it's a very interesting deck. The sideboard. Playing against a skilled player on Rhinos post sideboard is actually scary. Like, you say that Murktide is favorite against. I mean, people say that Murktide is favorite against Rhinos, but post sideboard is just, it gets very, very hard. They have so many flash threats, and the game gets very, very difficult. Okay, let's move on to Yawgmoth, which is obviously, we can agree that is a bad matchup. That is a matchup that you wanna try to avoid.
Yeah, I was very afraid about the Yawgmoth matchup. It was if you saw my matches against Eli, it almost broke me to play a different deck for the RC. Honestly, I was very concerned about the matchup. And the reason why I was so concerned is because I felt like I had everything I should need with the Stern Scoldings and the Brotherhood's End and the Subtleties and Cast into the Fire. All these cards that should theoretically be good, but it still can be a very tricky matchup to play. They have that flash element with Court of Calling and Bowmaster and Endurance. And they have, Grist, which is a really good answer to our Murktide Regents. And Delighted Halfling, you have to kill now, so their mana dorks are just always relevant. And I wrote an article on the Patreon, and one of the key points of it was just this Yawgmoth list is so much different from old Yawgmoth lists because it doesn't have bad cards in it anymore. You could say the Young Wolf is a bad card, which is fair, but old Yawgmoth lists used to have the Mana Dorks, and they used to have Strangleroot Geist and Eldritch Evolution and all these cards that you could kind of ignore. And so my plan would always be ignore those cards and just counterspell their Grist and their Yawgmoth, and then you in their Court of Calling, and you win. But now with Halfling and Bowmaster, it becomes and Cauldron. Yeah, Cauldron is the
that is the most important card.
Yeah, that Cauldron is the most important card. Mm. But just in general with Halfling and Bowmaster, also their deck becomes a lot better at being resilient to the plan of just like countering their mythic rare. And then Cauldron is huge. Yeah, Cauldron is a key card where you just can't beat it game one if it resolves, basically. And then post board you get some answers, and that's why I emphasized that. But
Okay, so how are you doing there? Because I see a lot of cards that you
mhm,
could potentially bring
yeah,
in: the Stern Scolding, the Subtleties, the Brothers Who End, the Cast into Fire, the Pithing Needle. Did you bring in the third Shredder as well?
yeah. So the cards that I would consider absolute like must-haves would be the two Scolding, the Cast into the Fire, and the Pithing Needle. And then I was pretty sure that Subtlety, Brotherhood's End, and Shredder were good as well. I think that the easy cut is for Ragavan because of Bowmaster and Young Wolf. So I started
And
there.
the Spell
The Spell
Pierces.
Pierces are the other card where I experimented keeping them in for a while because I felt, Court of Calling and Cauldron are two of their best cards against us. But I think just ultimately it's too narrow. So I think that it's a card you can also cut. The next cuts are trickier. What I found is I was pretty okay cutting DRC on the draw. The reason being that when you have Channeler on the draw, it's hard to play. You can't play it turn one because they could have Bowmaster. And then even turn two, if you try to play it and then they have Bowmaster, you have to like Stern Scolding the Bowmaster. So basically you want to wait until you have Delirium. But then they have Endurance in their deck, and also you're losing like the upside of playing a turn one Channeler, which is when it gets the most value, right? Like you want the Channeler to be in play, creating pressure and turning itself to be delirious. But it's harder to do that on the draw. On the play, you can still play turn one Channelers, so I liked it more. But ultimately, kind of where I landed is definitely on the draw. I'm going to be cutting down those Channelers and bringing in, I think the swap that you made is exactly what I would do. And then on the play, I was definitely on the fence. I definitely want the Shredder on the play. I think I want the Shredder play and draw. But I was less sure about the Subtleties on the play. That was the card I was less sure about. So then the question is what do you cut? I think ultimately I kind of just ended up. Oh, I think the Borrower was a card that you can cut on the play, and then shave. Well, this is set. You could do this, or you could shave two Channelers for the Subtleties.
Okay. Yeah, this is again, if you're watching on YouTube, we are making those changes, of course. But if you're just listening, so you always cut Ragavans and Spell Pierce, and play draw you cut Channelers, and you can cut maybe a couple of them. I remember that the winner of Mox, Gracias por tanto, he was cutting Channelers, both play draw in a lot of matches. We'll see later when we talk about Scam, but he was definitely cutting them against Yawgmoth. So it's interesting that you also agree in that. I believe in my planning I keep them. Just let me double check. But yeah, I was keeping them, but I also had less, I guess, cards to bring in. I only had one Cast into the Fire. I didn't have the third
Right.
Shredder.
Which
And I was even keeping in the Spell Pierces.
That's funny. I seem to remember you used to cut them against Yawgmoth. I guess it just comes down to the mapping.
Yeah, yeah, I was cutting them against Yawgmoth in the past, but I feel like the Yawgmoth deck changed a lot. Now it's just that you can't really play too long of a game because they have a lot more threats with the Cauldron. So I just wanna kill them. Plus, like now you have Stern Scolding, which wasn't a card we had, and I have four. So now I can easily go like as you said, turn two Channeler, counter your Orc, and then it's my turn three, and it's very likely that I'm in Delirium.
Yeah.
So then I have to worry only about Endurance, but they play like one or two.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I feel like ever since Stern Scolding is in the mix, Channeler is better against Yogg, but obviously like you don't play on turn one on the draw ever, even if you keep it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what you do and say totally makes sense, and I don't I don't claim to be right on keeping the channeler, but as I said, other the Mox winner also also cuts them, so it can totally be the right play. Okay, let's move on to Scam. This is another popular matchup. I saw that you beat them. You beat it quite a few times in this tournament.
Twice. Yep. And then also
Twice.
the
Okay.
Jun Saga deck, not the same, but another.
Okay, John Saga one.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So against Scam, I think this is one of our best matchups, and it's another draw to the deck. I think just Scam being a very popular deck, always people still have clung on to it even after the Fury ban, and it's still debatably strong. I think that its recent results haven't been as good, but what I'm really focused on is I think Scam has to take the aggressive role, so I want to sideboard in a way that is going to help me kind of offset that aggression. So Subtlety is a card that I think is pretty good just to stop their scams, but also a key dynamic of Postboard is Leyline of the Void, so having more threats to beat Leyline of the Void is nice. You can hardcast Subtlety. Stern Scolding is great. It answers all their creatures. It answers the Bowmasters, Grief, these cards that are, normally going to enter the battlefield and get value against removal. So Stern Scolding's great. The Shredder comes in because they have Leyline of the Void, so you want more threats. And then the Brotherhood's End, going back to my point about they're the aggro deck, I think Brotherhood's End could be a super devastating draw against some of their better draws. So if they're a lot of the time that they're seemingly going to win is when they have, either Grief Scam or they have Bowmaster into Voidwalker and then give it Undying so your Lightning Bolt doesn't work. Stuff like that is kind of what feels the scariest. So Brotherhood's End also is good. Cards that I cut, I agree cutting DRC is the right way to go. This is kind of just a hedge to Leyline in the Void. I think DRC is actually really great game one. But when they have the Leyline of the Voids, I'd rather be more resilient to that. And then with the Stern Scoldings, you can protect your Ragavan reasonably well against Bowmasters. So that's 6 cards that you're bringing in, and then you're cutting the DRCs. I like shaving at least one Spell Pierce. On the draw, I actually don't mind keeping in a Spell Pierce and cutting one Ragavan. I think you still have enough threats. I usually would cut one Spell Pierce either way, but Spell Pierce hits Fable, which they have 4 of, and that's a pretty reasonable hit. It can protect your threat from a removal spell. I think that it has some play for sure, and Ragavan's not essential, but I do like having the threats. I will say one interesting thing about the Scam matchup that changed is previously they had Fury, so turn 1 Ragavan was risky because they could just have Fury or a removal spell. But now looking at Scam lists, they only have 4 Bolt/Push turn 1. So on the play, Ragavan is actually kind of hard for them to kill. It's like Rhinos where they just have 4 answers. So Ragavan can actually be really valuable on the play, and then you can usually protect it pretty well with like Stern Scolding and removal spells.
Yeah, another important change that you made was that you don't have any Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the sideboard. I decided to play them to edge against Scam, which you say it's one of your best matchup. I always found it to be like fine, but it's always still like this Orcish Bowmaster matchup.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, can't be too good.
Sure.
So I had the Fables, but you cut them. You have no Fables, and
Yeah.
don't feel like it's a problem for you to win the Scam matchup.
I felt pretty confident against Scam. I think that also having the 4 bolts is nice against them because it's like just answering their board is usually what matters most. So I felt that my deck was constructed in a way that was already pretty good into Scam. And then I think post board, you just want to make sure that you can have a plan against their Leyline of the Voids because that's the scariest thing. Fable, I think, is good against Scam, and if I was expecting, the meta to be a very high number of Scam, then I would probably at some point bring Fable. But I find the card to be pretty narrow. Otherwise, like there wasn't a ton of other top matchups I was excited to bring it in against. Like I didn't really want it against Yawgmoth or Rhinos, any of those, or Amulet. So I just, the sideboard slots were too tight to have Fable, ultimately, in my opinion.
And yeah, let's go ahead and do the mirror match. So you said you you side out the Chandler in the mirror match. This is definitely something I wasn't doing that, and yeah, I like to hear your reasoning for doing this.
Yeah, my reasoning is mostly just the mirror match always feels like it comes down to iteration and Murktide region, and then Ledger Shredder is another card that can definitely take over some games because it can get out of range of the removal spells, get value, help you prevent flooding, etc. But the one mana threats I find are not as likely to be very impactful because the opponent has their 7 1-mana removal spells. And if you do have the cards you can sideboard that will help you interact on the axis of Murktide Regent and Iteration, I'd prefer to have those cards. So it just kind of depends on how the mapping works out. But for example, I'm happy to have Flusterstorms. That's going to help me protect Murktide. It's going to help me fight over Iteration. So that's a card I'm pretty happy to have. The Shredder I'd like to have for sure. And then I actually like Subtleties because I think that they can be hard cast pretty often. The mirror match often goes super long and is very Drago. But even evoking a Subtlety on a Murktide it randomly has blown me out and also blown my opponent out when they think their Murktide is safe, but then you just put what would be an 8/8 Murktide on top of their deck and they can't recast it for anything of similar size. It's not a perfect trade, but ultimately it's sometimes the tempo that you need. So I like those 5 cards. And then generally I would probably shave on the draw. You'll probably react to this. I'll probably shave a Ragavan on the draw for a similar reason to DRC. I personally don't like the 1-mana creatures very much. I think they're pretty likely to trade with removal that's in your opponent's hand. And if you could instead be doing more to interact with your opponent or further your game towards the Murktide Regents, I think that's going to end up being the most consistent strategy. Also, I think that Shredder is another card that makes DRC worse, just because that's another card where there could be a flyer in play that can either block or just eat DRC straight up when it has to attack. So
yeah, I definitely saw you citing out Ragavan a lot in the mirror match when I watch your content. So it's good to hear from you. So one thing I want to let you know, by these cyber mapping that we're doing, is that you're citing in subtlety a lot, and this is something that might pinpoint and ask you, why isn't it in the main deck? Have you given some thoughts about doing this? Because we've been mapping the top 4 matchups, and it's not even Amulet yet, where subtlety is obviously probably your best card. So this is something that it's something that maybe the viewer. So
it's a very fair question. I'm not sure my answer is 100% satisfactory, but my feel when I was playing games, I guess part of how I build my deck is with explicit logic, but the other part is just feel of how games are playing out. And it felt like the subtlety was often, being stuck in my hand. It doesn't do a ton early on because I didn't want to evoke it in a lot of matchups, with the exception being against Amulet. I was pretty fine evoking it, but a lot of the matchups I didn't feel like subtlety was very productive in my hand early on, and it was just kind of causing my hands to get clunky. And then when I look at post-board games, I find often they slow down because you're bringing in cards that interact with your opponent usually, and so their subtlety can definitely be better. You're trying to play a more controlling role against Yawgmoth. I'm not sure how good subtlety would actually be game 1 against Yawgmoth. I think that evoking it is pretty much not feasible because you're just going to run out of blue cards in your hand. You'll pitch your last blue card and then they'll put the threat on top and cast it again the next turn. And then against Scam, I think it's good when the games go longer, but if when they have Leyline of the Void, for example, but otherwise, if you're not catching an evoked grief against Scam. Even I felt that the games I was losing, I'd fall behind kind of early, and like maybe not be able to hard cast the subtlety, and pitch casting it is kind of it's a risky game. Like it kind of depends what you have, but pitching iteration or Murktide region doesn't feel very good either. So
yeah, so to explain your answer maybe a little bit more is that post Sideboard the games slow down, so it's much more easier to cast subtlety, so it's a better card post Sideboard than it is main deck.
I think that's the best way to articulate it. Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. I was not liking drawing it in all of my game ones, so I just moved it to the sideboard. And at some point I had none.
Yeah, sometimes
I brought it back to the sideboard.
Yeah, sometimes a card is just better post sideboard than it is main deck. Like maybe that's the case for like Brazen Borer as well. Something like that. Let's move on with probably the best deck at the moment in Modern, which is Living End. It did so well in all the RCs. It won in Canada, in Japan, in America came second. There was 3 in the mock showcase. So this weekend, if I had to do the power ranking now, I would definitely put Living End first, based on how it did. Even the stats from Sierkovitz has an outstanding Living End performance with like doubling the amount of players with 10 wins or more than they expected. And this is a matchup where, it's never that good, right? For Murktide. I mean, I've seen that you beat it, but it's not a matchup that you're like thrilled to play against it. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much on the head. It's not a matchup that I'm thrilled to play against, but I think it's very winnable. I mean, we're one of the decks that we have a lot of counter spells, and we also have Ragavan, which they can't really answer. And so that's the key to the matchup is you're just mulliganing pretty aggressively on 7 and even sometimes on 6 to look for Ragavan plus counters. And that's what I did in this event. So in my match against Living End, first I'll explain the match and then we can talk about sideboarding, because it was an interesting match. So I mulliganed to 5 game 1 because my hands I didn't have any counters. I think my 7 had 2 Ragavans and like an expressive iteration, but it was on the draw, so I felt it was too slow. But I mulliganed game 1 down to 5, and I end up keeping Spell Pierce, Counterspell, 2 lands, and what I found was, or what ended up happening this game, I think they just had the nuts. They like cycled, and then griefed, took one of my counterspells, and then had an upkeep. On my upkeep, Violent Outburst, Force of Negation, and so they killed me game 1. Post board, I brought in my Flusters, my Force Negation, my Shredder. I just cut, and I think I actually also bring in the Subtlety and Stern Scolding, with the plan being that you kind of want to try to isolate them onto Violent Outburst as best you can. And Subtlety and Stern Scolding hit Grief, which then makes their best, their line of play have to be Violent Outburst plus Force of Negation to beat you, usually, to beat your counter spells. So I like to bring in those cards and then cut most of my red removal, but they have Endurance and then sometimes hard cast stuff, so like I'll keep it in Unholy Heat or 2. But post board game 2, I think I just raced them with a Ragavan and such. But the interesting game was game 3, because they kept a hand on 7, and then turn 1 they just fetched a Surveil land. I played Ragavan, and then turn 2 they dead goned my Ragavan and played a tapped land. So I just played Ledger Shredder because they didn't have any creatures in their graveyard, so they can't actually Violent Outburst or like Cascade and get any value from it. Turn 3 they pass back with 3 mana, and this is where I'm curious what you would have done. This is my what's the play for you, because they passed back with 3 mana. I think they played a fetch land for turn. And my hand is Murktide Regent, Ledger Shredder number 2, Counterspell Stern Scolding, and I have 3 lands. So I can pass with Counterspell Stern Scolding, which seems like the safest, play, that I can stop Grief. I can counterspell a Shardless Agent or Violent Outburst. But I start to think, okay, if they haven't been cycling, what could their hand actually be? And my fear is that they probably have a very good hand with like a couple Cascaders and maybe a Grief or a Force Negation. And I kind of figure out, or in my opinion, my best chance here is to play the second Ledger Shredder, even though it means that they could go like cycle, because they did have 1 draw step. They could cycle a couple times and cast a Cascader, and I have my counter spell is down. But I play the Shredder. I think another card they could definitely have in this spot is Endurance, if they're like not playing any Cascade cards, or not cycling any cards. But I'm curious if you what you would do there, because it's a risky play. I think that like every instinct in your body is telling you just like hold up Counterspell, you're holding on to it, but it's just kind of hard because you need to pressure them. I have a 1/3 Ledger Shredder. If they do have Endurance, I'm gonna like have to counterspell it or something. So I just like play the Ledger Shredder and I don't even attack with the other Ledger Shredder. So that if they have Endurance, it's not very good in that spot. But I think that it was a pretty interesting situation.
Yeah, for sure. This is a very typical spot with Murktide, right? When to extend and like have the shield down, but like if you pass the knight, then you're gonna probably win the game, or when to just pass it back. Like for example, I was in a similar spot to this one to you, and I played an iteration. I had up Spell Pierce and Force of Negation. I played an iteration, didn't find a blue card, and died to like Grief plus Cascade. And if I just passed with 4 mana up, then I would have had double counter. So it is very much like, I mean, there isn't often an answer, right, for this type of games. It's very much like vibes, like what do you feel your opponent has in hand, like how have them been playing, and a lot of questions like that. I mean, Living End is a deck that if they have the perfect hand or the perfect draws, they can always beat you, like regardless of what you have, because they always have like the perfect counterplay, like the Grief, the Force of Negation, the Mystical Dispute. So sometimes it's just you kind of have to hope they don't have the third land, or they don't have the Cascaders, or all those sort of things. And again, I see that you don't even I see that you don't have the Chalice, or even the Turf Last Storm. I was very much like ready to play against Living End, and I did play against 2 in my first 2 rounds. So I guess, but I still went 1-1. But overall,
no, I think
it's a tough matchup.
Yeah, it can be definitely a tricky matchup, and I think that I didn't respect it as much as I should have, especially given like the incentives are there to play it. Rhino's had a really good time recently, and it's a great matchup for Living End. And then Scam hasn't done as well recently, and Scam is like one of the harder matchups for Living End just because of Dothy Voidwalker and Thoughtseize plus pressure. It can be tricky for Living End, right? But that's my understanding of Living End, at least. But we still have moves. I think that open deck list, I was convinced that there was a big impact there because like I said, I think that you can get an edge in game 1 just by knowing you can mulligan pretty aggressively to like Ragavan plus counter spells. Obviously I still lost the game 1 because they had Grief plus Violent Outburst plus Force Negation. But because I knew that it was Living End, game 1, I was able to mulligan to 5 and force them to have that combination of cards. Like if they didn't have Grief, Force Negation, and Violent Outburst, I actually would have been in fine shape there. And that's like usually game 1 you just get crushed because you have like an Unholy Heat and a Lightning Bolt in hand that does nothing. And you don't have enough counter spells. Like your hand has an expressive iteration you can never cast because it's too clunky. So I did think that helps the Murktide side a little bit, is open deck lists.
I wanted to ask you, how many Unholy Heats and Lightning Bolt do you leave? Is it 4? Is it 3?
Yeah, so
like, do you bring the Stern Scold in? Like, how do you cyber here?
Yeah, so I bring in, I definitely cut all the bolts, and then I depending on how many like endurance they have, I sometimes have some unholy heats, but I'll like to bring in subtlety before stern scolding. Because subtlety is free, and also because subtlety plays against their endurance and their hardcast plan, which when I played some matchups against Living End, I actually did sometimes lose to them hard casting creatures randomly. But I think that just having some unholy heats in for the endurance and their hard cast creatures is more valuable than Bolt being able to go face. So I think that this is a pretty reasonable way to sideboard. We have one Stern Scolding. I'm seeing if there's anything else. Like,
what do you think about Stern Scolding? Would you like to have more? It's only for grief, of course.
No, I think that there is an argument to bring in another one, or maybe even all of them. Just going back to like, I think if you can isolate, or if you can always have an answer for grief, then it puts a lot of pressure on the Living End player to have Force of Negation and like a Violent Outburst, which it narrows the range of hands that are going to beat you. If you don't have an answer to grief, and the grief can take your Flusterstorm or Counterspell, then Shardless is still pretty good against you. So I do like having like at least the two subtleties and the one Stern Scolding main deck still. And I think that bringing in like another Stern Scolding or two is pretty defensible. It's just tricky to figure out what to cut. Like, I think you could cut an Iteration. I think you could maybe cut like a Murktide Regent or the Borrower. The Murktide Regents are usually pretty slow, but they're still not bad. I would still like to have some, but yeah, I think those are all cards you could cut for Stern Scolding. It's pretty defensible.
All right, let's do the last one, the last important match, and then we'll be free. And then I'll free you. We can because I don't think we mentioned it yet, but we are recording a very strange time for Max. This is after your full day of work at like, what time is it? 1 a.m.
It's almost 1 a.m. Yeah.
It's almost 1 a.m. And for me, at the beginning of my day, I set an alarm at 6 a.m. today to record this before going to Chicago later today. So I'm gonna have a long day ahead of me today. But yeah, I'm always excited to make this type of content. I know that people love this deep dive, hearing their decks in and out for an hour, and like not just a cyber map, but an explanation of how, like, your explanation on your game against Living End, what happened, what would you do, stuff like that. This is definitely something that the listeners can enjoy and ask themselves those questions. Maybe sometimes like pause and refocus on your scenario to understand it better. This is something that I do when I listen to this type of podcast or watch your video, for example. Okay, so final match against Amulet Titan. Final matchup, sorry. This is something, I'm interested here because I test this matchup a lot against my teammates. I was testing against Strasky and Janara, and I definitely had a lot of good games, and that helped me figure out things a lot. But all right, so just let's get into it. You like what? Subtlety, Blood Moon, Cast into Fire, Pithing Needle.
Actually, I'm not so sure about Pithing Needle. So
yeah,
you can name the One Ring. I know that a lot of Amulet players take out Urza's Saga post board. Maybe if they only see one Blood Moon, they don't do that though. So it's kind of, I guess I didn't fully figure that part out. But I know that a lot of Amulet players do like to shave down on the Urza's Saga. So like Pithing Needle would just be for the One Ring, which is fine. But when they have like Besejus already in their deck for Blood Moon, like the Pithing Needle can be kind of unreliable. Like if they care about it, they can just blow it up. And if they don't care about it, it's a dead card. I actually don't mind Brotherhood's End. I definitely like Force of Negation, because Force of Negation hits Amulet, Defense Grid, and the One Ring, as well as Summoner's Pact. Brotherhood's End hits the Amulets and Defense Grid, and like sometimes if you Subtlety them or Counterspell a Titan and then kill like 2 Amulets, that can come up. But again, like Brotherhood's End is weird because they cut sagas, or my impression is they cut sagas, so they're less likely to have multiple Amulets in play. And then Stern Scolding is also an interesting card because they have Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which you can't bolt, and you can heat it if you have Delirium, but it's a pretty good card for them, just to like help them accelerate up to a Titan and also block like Ragavan potentially. I think the easy cuts are the 2 Shredder, like you just pulled aside there. 1 Iteration is usually a card I'm pretty happy to shave. I actually was always cutting 2 Iteration, just because I felt like I didn't fully have the time to execute that plan. And then I think I would probably start shaving some bolts. I don't hate Lightning Bolt in the matchup because killing a Grazer to push through Ragavan can be pretty important, but ultimately when you have this like long list of cards in the sideboard that you want to board in, Bolt is a card that kind of stands out as being a little bit one-dimensional and maybe not exactly where you want to be. So I think I would shave those 7 cards, and then I think that I got...
What about Spell Pierce?
So
what do you think about Spell
Pierce? So yeah,
Pierce?
I like Spell Pierce, personally. I think that there are a lot of chances to use it really effectively. It hits Defense Grid, it hits Amulet on turn 1 sometimes, which comes up, and then it hits the One Ring, which I think comes up a lot. And then finally, like, you can use it on a Summoner's Pact if they have 6 mana, and then they have to pay for the Spell Pierce, and then they search, but then they have to pay for the pact the next turn. So it actually works on the pact pretty well as well. So I like Spell Pierce a lot in the matchup.
What about Brazen Borrower?
It's another card that I'm fine cutting. I think that it's reasonable just as a flash 3/1 flyer, so you can provide pressure, because I think pressure is really important in the matchup, but it's okay to cut as well. So those are the cards that I'm pretty interested in. The Stone Scolding is the one card that I'm iffy on. Like, if you hit a Dryad, it's really good, but they have Defense Grid, so I don't know if I want to play into that super hard. And like, sometimes it can be awkward to time the Stern Scolding on the Dryad. So I don't know. I think that it's pretty reasonable. Oh, you cut Unholy.
I found it
interesting.
I found in my testing that the play draw made a huge difference here, because on the play you would only have to worry about Grazer to stop your Ragavan, but on the draw you would also have to worry about the Dryad with Elysian Grove. So I actually found out that on the draw I was happy to cut the whole package of Ragavan and Lightning Bolt, which were just kind of keeping me back a bit. Like, if you have to keep in Bolt to kill their Grazer, it's 2 cards, the Ragavan and the Bolt, that you don't want to draw in late game. Whereas on the play, I was just happy to keep them. And a card that I actually found weak on the play in my, Bolt plus Ragavan plan was Unholy Heat, which surely, kills what he has to kill, but it requires some setup. And it's a card that if you draw it early game, it's kind of bad. I was just honestly just at the RC itself, I was playing 0 Shredder, and I was just siding out 4 Unholy Heat. And honestly, I had a fantastic testing time against Amulet with the plan of cutting the Ragavans and Bolts on the draw and cutting the Unholy Heats on the play. I was beating it in testing. I beat it at the RC the one time because, again, my RC didn't go well, but overall I was happy with this sideboarding against Amulet, and just the taking out Ragavan on the draw and taking out Heat on the play. This is what I was doing.
I think that your logic is pretty sound. I like Ragavan. I like the upside that it offers, but you are right that when you have to worry about Grazer, and then also you have to worry about Dryad coming down on the draw, Ragavan, there's a lot of times where it'll be kind of invalidated. I think that that's kind of mitigated a little bit. Like, I would often be fine trading my Ragavan plus like maybe an Unholy Heat for the Dryad if I had to, but it's not an ideal scenario, so I think that your logic definitely checks out there, and my sideboard has more than enough cards to bring in. I did for a while. I tried like really making sure that I held up Stern Scolding for Dryad to make sure that wasn't a problem, and that was kind of a mixed success. But I see your point.
Like, for example, in my RC. I was on the draw, so I won game 1, and then on the draw, my opponent goes turn 1 Amulet, I go Fetch and go, and they go Bounce Lane Dryad, and I go Stern Scolding. And that Thirst Scolding right there is just it's just a time walk. It's like exactly a time walk because they don't even make a land drop because they have to get back the land. And then you untap, and then like the game from there progresses in a way that if you didn't have Thirst Scolding by that Unholy Heat, you would never like you would have probably not have won that game. So it is something that I think Thirst Scolding is super good in this matchup. I think I was bringing in all of them. No, I guess on the play I was only bringing in one, but on the draw I was having all four of them because I was playing two main. So it is a card that I found very very powerful. But overall, I had the Magus of the Moon, but if I had to go back, I wouldn't have it anymore. Mostly, I was afraid to cut it because if it's open deck list, they see you don't have it, they don't bring in Dismember, and their deck is just a better deck, because they don't have Dismember in their deck. So this is something that I was afraid of cutting, but in the hindsight, I wish I had some more cards like you had for other matchups.
Yeah, I always thought the Dismember thing was interesting because, I mean, Dismember also just, like, hits Dragon Rage Channeler or Ragavan, which isn't even necessarily that horrible. It's not ideal, but I feel like
it goes under.
Yeah, I just think that sometimes I got like my one drop dismembered and it wasn't even that bad, so I just gave up on the Magus. But I see your point for sure. Like, it's nice to have a card that your opponent has to respect more in the sideboard and open deck list.
Yeah, I'm playing a little bit of Amulet now, and just for fun with my friends in paper. And I think if I knew my opponent didn't have any Magus, I wouldn't bring in Dismember just because. Like, the Amulet deck needs so many pieces to work. Like, you need enough lands, enough cards. And if you add to that a card that just doesn't help your plan at all, you're just making your deck worse. Like, every time you side in, like, Defense Grid and Dismember, you can get hands, like, more clunky draws. And
sure.
You're actually siding out important pieces for your deck for these cards.
Right. Well, my point, I agree that's a good point, that, like, if you don't have Magus, they probably don't bring in Dismember. But the flip side is, like, if you do have Magus and they bring in Dismember, it's not like it's going to be blanked. It'll usually have a target for some value one way or another. So I didn't respect that dynamic as much.
And another important suggestion is to try to play your Murktide as a 6/6.
Yep, definitely.
Exactly because of Dismember.
Yeah.
Same thing against Rhinos with Flame of Anor. Yep. This is something that, we're talking about sideboarding and decks and everything, but also some, like, I guess, play tip here and there.
If they have Dismember, play Murktide as a 6/6. If they have Unholy Heat, play Murktide as a 7/7 at least. So and it's worth waiting the extra turn usually. I mean, it depends, but
if they have Brazen Bar, play Murktide as 4/4.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you have to be careful. But in the mirror matches, never play Murktide. This is like the very last card you want to play. There are definitely a lot of interesting dynamics. This is a very fun deck. Like, whenever I talk about it, I just really want to play it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But again, I think we've said a lot. I think it's time to say goodbye. But it was I had a great time, and you definitely told a lot of very important notions for the future of this deck. Max, will I see you in Chicago this next week?
Well, it would be great if I did see you in Chicago. My only problem is I did not buy a badge in time. So I actually live in Chicago, and I could easily go, but I need to find a badge. So if anyone has a lead to a badge, I'll use a shameless plug on the podcast. Please sell me your badge. I'm looking for a Saturday badge ideally, but I'd buy a weekend badge or whatever.
Yeah, if you're listening to 1 hour 20 minutes of this podcast and you know anyone that has a badge, please. Give it to Max.
Yeah. And now I get to play the Secret Lair Showdowns because I'm qualified for Seattle already. And the Secret Lair Showdowns have a very cool Murktide Regent promo. So hopefully I'll be competing in those, playing Murktide, of course.
Max, I have a question for you. What's the card that you signed the most? If you signed
sign cards?
Some of them.
Yeah. I haven't signed too many cards, but probably Murktide Regent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did meet a lot of Murktide fans this past weekend. Maybe I'm not of enough fame yet for them to ask me to sign cards, but I did have a lot of people thank me for the YouTube videos, which was awesome. That people have been getting value from them. Everyone's been watching them and kind of hopefully learning together. My goal is always to bring Murktide players up so that people stop making fun of us, saying that we're Jund and we're 48% against everything. And this weekend in the USRC, our win rate was above 50%. I think that that stat you had on Twitter about expected top finishes came through. And Murktide is a deck that definitely rewards a lot of practice and tight play, because it's not as linearly powerful in a lot of senses than other decks. So it's a lot harder to get wins by mistake. So it's a really fun deck, though, a really rewarding deck. That's what I love about it. I get excited talking about it. All the games are always very interesting, and makes Magic a very fun hobby when you're playing this deck.
Okay. Thank you so much, Max, for being here again. You can support Max at patreon.com/Murktide. You can support the Carnies at patreon.com/Carnies. And of course, if you're watching this video on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, press the like button, leave a comment. If you're if you're listening on any podcast platform, let us know on Twitter at Mengu09 or at TwinlessTwin if you like this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Max, again for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. The Carnies is awesome. Like I said, helped me prepare for the RC and had some great success. So you guys are very smart for listening.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.